So here at The Pulse, we like to explore the thinking, the ideas, the worldviews behind why our world is the way it is. Because we feel when we do this, we empower ourselves to create a better world at its core. And part of examining these deeper questions really comes back to looking at ourselves, right? What is our state of being? And at the core of our state of being is the discussion of our nervous system. What is that looking like? How is it communicating with the mind and the body and the heart? And so to dive into this a lot more deeply, today we're going to be talking with nervous system expert and somatic practitioner, Irene Lyon. Let's dive in. So welcome, Irene. It's great to be having this discussion here today. How you doing?
Hey Joe, I'm good. I'm doing very well. Thank you.
That's good. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
feeling good is going to kind of be the topic of this whole thing a little bit. Um, the word trauma has come up so much in the past while. We're seeing lots of like online events going on where, we're hearing about collective traumas through this whole COVID pandemic situation. And, the subject of mental health, which relates to all of this, is obviously been a growing discussion for, people in society for a long time. And as trauma gets larger, what I've noticed, for example, is that it's a confusing word. What does that mean exactly? And I know you've been working in this field for a long time. Why don't we start by sort of defining and setting up a context for what exactly is trauma?
Yeah. So I kind of have a couple of answers for that. So I'm going to give you a few of them.
Yeah.
So if we think of how we used to think of trauma or how it still is thought of in certain like medical situations, I love a good medical drama show. And, when someone is in a car accident, they've had a trauma or they've had a head trauma, or they go to the trauma wing and the trauma surgeon sees them and it's an accident, something's wrong medically, they have to get fixed by the surgeon that's a trauma surgeon. So there's that, scary big things that occur and then you want to get them fixed. In the work that I have gotten into over the last 20 or so years, I and my colleagues see trauma more as not in the event per se, but something that is going on internally in the physiology, we would say within the nervous system, to use a fancy word, the autonomic nervous system specifically, but also in the tissues and the organ systems and the immune system, the hormonal system, the signaling of things throughout the body. And the reason why we would use that definition that trauma is in the body, it is something stored in the body. Some would say it's a dysregulated nervous system. That's another way of defining it, is that you can have someone who is in an accident, for example, that is considered traumatic, but they walk away and they're fine, like they really are fine. And I use this analogy all the time as person A walks away from the fender bender car accident and they're like, that's no big deal, okay, whatever, oops, sorry. Life goes on. They have no panic the next day about getting into their car. They're not jumping with, that kind of thing. But then you have someone, person B, I often call them, who gets into the identical car accident, let's just say like a fender bender. No one's hurt. The car isn't even scratched. But person A walks away and they are literally screwed, very technical term. Their system is revved. They're afraid to get into their car. They are on hyper alert. They can't sleep. Their digestion goes off after a few months and they just go into this downward spiral. And while that might sound extreme, I have worked with people who would fit that bill. Mm-hmm. Something that occurs to them isn't that grand and they come away absolutely a mess with what we might classify as complex PTSD from like a tiny little thing. And so when you look at that, Joe, and you look, okay, well, why is one person having no problem and another isn't? We then look at, well, what was going on in their system prior to that accident? How was their system wired from the beginning? And how were they taught to deal with scary, uncertain, stressful things? And then from there, we kind of go down the rabbit hole of all the different scenarios. So in a nutshell, trauma is something that is occurring within the system, within the nervous system. We could also say it's something that we cannot process properly because of, let's just say, past history of either learning to or learning not to handle our physiological stress responses. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, it always does when you say
Okay.
it. So,
Okay, good.
And so, okay, so, and I'm going to ask this because this was a big sort of wake up call for me when I was diving into this stuff over the past while and following your work and having our wonderful discussions was really, you mentioned the car accident, right? A lot of times people might also think of, let's say they were skiing or snowboarding and boom, there was another accident, or maybe like their house got robbed or something and they were held, they actually saw the perpetrators or something like this. But I came to learn, I'd love for you to touch on this a little bit, that, these forms of trauma that can get stored up within the body can come from something like very small events over a prolonged period that don't feel like they should be traumatic. Like, for example, work stress, or having instability to your socioeconomic sort of stature. Can you touch more on like the sort of day-to-day societal type stuff that people might not think leads to trauma but could?
I just have to ask a question.
Yeah.
This isn't the end. Is the Zoom recording supposed to be happening, or are you have that on the back end?
The back end.
Okay, good.
But that is a great question.
Because part of me is like, I usually see the recording, so I just wanted to make sure. So,
it's a good question. Thank you for checking.
I didn't want to throw you off, but I could feel my heart kind of going, uh-oh, is this supposed to be showing? But you've got the backup camera happening, so.
Yeah. I got the camera so that if Zoom messes up, which it has a couple times, I'm good.
Awesome.
And we get higher quality this way. So
Good. Okay, just wanted to make sure because I could feel myself going into my own stress response, going So
it's a good check.
All right.
It's a good check.
So to answer your question around day-to-day stuff, which is from what I've understood you're asking, like how can day-to-day stressors, things that don't seem to be that, it's not a war zone, you're not in this accident every day, bombs aren't being dropped on us, that kind of thing. To answer that question, a lot of it has to come back to how was said person, so let's say that person who is under a lot of stress from work, are they aware that they're under stress? So are they listening to their body? And I'm going to say the word physiology a lot throughout our talk, because that's essentially what it is. So many people, and this is kind of the classic 9-to-5, industrialized, you sit, you work, you're all higher brain, typing, solving problems, having meetings. If someone isn't actively noticing their body and their physiology in those long stretches of time, Monday to Friday, months on end, years on end, they might not have any idea that when they're interacting with their boss or they're on a deadline, that they are revved at a high, we would call it sympathetic nervous system level. So adrenaline, they're being fueled by fight flight, which I think many people now know what that means. It's that get up and go stress response. So a lot of people are in these day-to-day worlds, whether it's work, whether it's the stress of the environment, whether it's I can't pay my bills, I'm stressed, where is the next meal going to come from, is the electricity going to get turned off? Like, we get used to these things, but the physiology, if we aren't listening to it, we'll miss the fact that our heart is constantly pumping too high.
Yeah.
Or that we are ignoring the signs in our gut that the food we're eating isn't good for us. I'm just throwing out some examples, or that we're actually so fatigued, but we're pumping ourselves with sugar, caffeine. I'm not against caffeine. I have my cup in the morning, but that incessant every hour to the coffee pot, another latte, another shot of espresso, smoking, whatever people might use to give themselves a hit. We just don't realize that we're on this kind of base. It's not even a baseline. We're off of baseline, and we're sort of living in this chronically stressed situation, which then trickles out to the whole physiology. Mm-hmm. But then we get used to it, Joe. It's like that classic example of you put, this is a graphic, but you put the frog in the pot of cold water, and you slowly turn up the heat. It doesn't realize that it's getting cooked, but if you throw a frog in quickly, it jumps out.
Yep.
That is sort of what has been occurring with human civilization for a very long time, is things just keep shifting and changing, and we keep adapting and adapting, but we're not adapting from a point of good, healthy nervous system regulation. A lot of our adaptation is based on a foundation that was already not well to begin with.
Yes.
And so there's this story of just when did it start, all these troubles within our physiology, and that's a long story as well.
Yeah, it's almost like we're finding ways to use wellness, for example, to cope with the insanity of what's taking place, or the intensity of what's taking place in our world and our society and how it functions. And I think you mentioned even earlier, and maybe this is where we can get into the discussion of what's actually happening in the physiology, but you mentioned the idea of we're almost containing these symptoms and these issues. We're not actually dealing with them. So we're learning to just kind of cope with unreasonable amounts of stress, right? Versus doing something more. So why don't we dive into sort of, just to give a sort of an underlying, what's actually happening in the body and the physiology and the nervous system when this stuff is accumulating? What's going on there?
Well, we could say that's our current human condition of chronic. If I take it to the far end, accumulating, and not just stress, but toxic stress, accumulating the emotions, the sensations, the boundaries that aren't protected, it adds up. And through some research that has been quite prominent over the last 20 or so years, namely the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which we can dive into details if you want to, it showed that, or it is showing, because it's this ongoing kind of study, that when we have got a lot of chaos at that autonomic nervous system level, so we would call it dysregulation, over time, and if it's not worked with specifically, we will get sick. Yeah. And the list of, so to answer the question, what's happening in the body, it depends a lot on the person. So some folks will end up with what we would call as cancer. Some people would get heart disease. Some people might have a mental illness predisposition. Some people might have an autoimmune predisposition. Some it's gut. Some it's diabetes. Sometimes it's a different type of hormonal, skin flares, so many things that we consider chronic disease. They will pop into from symptoms into, say, disease when that stuff is stored. So it's kind of interesting because in our current medical world, we treat, there's a hospital just down the road from me. There's the Center for Skin, there's a center for rheumatoid arthritis, for cancer, for heart disease. And yet when you look at a lot of this research, that initial foundational wound, if you will, that pops all these troubles comes from this dysregulation at the autonomic nervous system level. Now, we also have to make sure that someone might be saying, well, Irene, isn't that because of nutrition and not enough exercise? It's like, yes. Let's just say all those things are taken care of in a person's system. And a lot of my students and clients, they are saints with their diet, with their practices, and they're still having these chronic conditions. Mm-hmm. And so they're often thought of, Joe, as psychosomatic, like they're making it up. Like back in the day, people used to think someone with fibromyalgia or chronic pain, chronic fatigue, were just lazy. Yeah. Right? They're just lazy. They just get up, just come on, get up and start moving, start doing things. Like, why can't you get out of bed? And so what's occurring in the system is it is so overly stressed with trapped fight, flight. And then the key word I haven't mentioned yet is freeze. Mm-hmm. So that parasympathetic high level shutdown that basically protects the person from feeling all the fight, flight. And so to actually go back to one of your first questions, we don't, and again, I'm generalizing, humans in the current Western world, let's just say, often don't realize how much they're overriding their physiology. And we've become masters at that by co-opting and using this primitive physiological shutdown freeze response of our parasympathetic nervous system that can actually numb us out from all the bad, scary stuff that's not only happening outside, the chaos, but it's also happening inside. And someone be like, yeah, I'm cool as a cucumber. Like, oh yeah, I can go jump off a cliff. I mean, I was that kid in my 20s. I did extreme sports.
Yeah.
Like adrenaline to the max, where most people, they think about what I used to do and they're like, they would go into panic mode. And I was in such a functional freeze pattern. I was functional, I went through 2 university degrees. I traveled the world. All the things. But there was this layer of coping that I didn't know I had. And I had a really lovely upbringing. So it wasn't because I was beaten and abused and was neglected as a kid. It was just the conditioning of society, which goes back to your first thing, which is this constant stress. Like, we don't realize that really in many ways, humanity, we're that frog in that pot, and it's just the heat just is going up and up. But we're at that point right now where we want to jump out of that pot, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered your question, but
I one of the things, I'm feeling like it's a good time to dive into functional freeze here a little bit, because, and I know we've had a number of conversations, trying to sort of examine, if society is in some way, shape, or form happening to all of us, right? And there's different areas of the world that are having different types of experiences. Some you could argue, which I hope we've learned up to this point in this podcast, that, there is no objective trauma. It's all subjective, right? Like, people can experience different things and not have an experience.
Yes.
So when we're here in the West and say, oh, look how good we have it, the people over there don't even have this, that, or whatever, it doesn't matter, right? We're all experiencing what we experience. And this idea of functional freeze, I want to contextually jump into this by just sort of throwing out my story a little bit, just so that we can come back to it and just use Joe as a specimen here. But, it's interesting because, I would have told you I was like this high functioning, and I was, right? I was like, in my early 20s, I built, CE as a company. Everything was going great. I was super happy-go-lucky. I had energy all the time. Everything was fantastic. And, it wasn't until around mid to late 2017 where I suddenly kind of went into this censorship happened, right? The era of suddenly our business was under attack 24/7 by these big tech companies. I was constantly going through an experience of they were just literally just taking money. Everything we had built, they were just taking it away and taking it away and taking it away. And I was in this stress, and I would turn to my partner and I'd say, Ruby, like, I know that I'm under a level of stress I've just never been exposed to, and like, it's gonna kill me. Like, it's just mounting and mounting and mounting and mounting. And it would go to points where I'm just like, it's wanting to enter into food comas and just wanting to, like, I couldn't move because it was just, there was so much, it was an unreasonable amount of attack. And I had dealt prior to that with issues and challenges in the business, no problem. You take it, face it head on, you're good, you work around the challenges. But this was just so much at once. And it was through that late 2017 into 2019, into 2020. And I was doing an interview with Mickey Willis, and I said to him at the end, honestly, I think I've become traumatized. And I got teary-eyed because he had gave me a compliment, and I had realized how that compliment affected my body in a way that welled up all this emotion of how I'm constantly attacked, right? That's what the story was, and that's what was happening in life too. And all of a sudden, like, somebody's recognizing it, and I was like, oh. And it was just it was an interesting experience. And that's how, you and I met, and we started talking more about this stuff. And, my journey into exploration went into this, and we sort of asked the question. So we're coming back to functional freeze here. That's kind of my story. I went through an incredibly difficult 3 or 4 years or so. I'm still trying to come out of the trauma and the dysregulation that has happened within my nervous system, within my body, which affects my brain sometimes, it affects my sleep, it affects my gut, it affects all these different things. But the question of functional freeze, was I in a functional freeze prior to that, which allowed this constant event to create the situation that I'm in now? So let's dive into that. What exactly functional freeze is and how it can go unnoticed.
Yes. Well, thanks for resharing that story, because that is how we originally connected, was that interview with Mickey. And I haven't met him personally, but he is a very kind, empathetic, strong human soul. And so for someone to say that to you, I would hope, and it did, it pierced through something. It kind of shattered the glass, so to speak, maybe that was there protecting you, waiting for that next hit from an anonymous source, from the overlords of big tech or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Because, and I was speaking to someone about this the other day, like, we don't realize, well, we do, we know in tribal culture, if someone does something wrong, they are left, like they are taken out into the jungle and left.
Yeah.
They are shamed, they're extricated. It's like, and you will not survive very long in that way, without community and connection and help and support. And so you take yourself, and you're in this business, and then you're getting hit, and it's almost like you're being thrown out, you're being exiled, but you're not, because you're still with your partner, you still have your connection. So it's very confusing.
Yeah.
Right? It's not as cut and dry as that sort of tribal example. The functional freeze thing is interesting because it's a fairly new term. But when you start to talk about it, it will hit a chord with people who maybe have it. And there also might be a defense. But from what I've seen, Joe, most people, when they hear it, they're like, oh yeah, that's probably me. So I'll just use it contextually. One of the ways that it starts, and there's many ways it starts. But if we think about children when they're being raised, and another one of my classic examples is you have little Johnny or Susie, whoever, riding their bike, learning how to ride a bike at age like 4 or 5. And they fall. At least back in the day, like, there were no training wheels, like, you fell and you scraped your knee and it hurts, right? It hurts to break the skin and to feel the sand in there, and you don't know what just happened, and you're disoriented, and maybe you bumped your head or your whatever. How your primary caregiver, whether it's your older sibling, your parent, your grant, whoever, how they interact with you when you have your first real hurt, your first, owie, as we might call it, will set the tone for how we experience the rest of our life. Now, I know that might seem extreme, but that is the imprinting. If a child has never felt pain, never had an accident, this would be one of those traumas, the kind of accident traumas. They feel the chemicals, they feel the heat, their heart rate is going to go up. They're going to be disoriented. They're not going to know what this pain is that's stinging, and then this desire to maybe want to cry or scream, so many emotions going on and sensations. And so if that caregiver comes up to you and says, you're fine, and not in a way that's mean or harsh or abusive, but just like, you're fine, come on, get up, you can get up, you're a big boy or a big girl, show us you're strong, this is my acting here. And little Johnny or Susie doesn't know any different, because this is the first time they've had this life experience. They start to override their physiology in that moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so little Johnny, Susie is like, oh, okay, well, they don't even think it. They feel what's happening, and there is an instant shutdown of those sensations, emotions, crying red in the face. It gets stopped, Joe,
Yeah.
because that higher brain at that age is able to work. And it sees my main caregiver wants me to be okay, so I better well be okay.
Right.
So I get on that bike, I keep pedaling, but, and again, this is like a proxy for the rest of our worlds, is I'm now on that bike. I am containing pain, maybe blood dripping down my leg that I've never felt before. I want to cry. It's like I'm so scared, but mom says no. And so I'm looking at her. Am I doing this okay? And then I'm disconnected from my body. I'm disconnected from my bike. I'm less alert to my environment, perhaps, because I'm stuck in this stress response. So the stress response kind of has this sine wave thing where it goes up, it peaks, and then we want to come down. That little Johnny Susie on her bike or his bike, they're like hovering at the top of the stress response, trying to live. And then they go back home, and let's just say they have dinner that night, and maybe mom serves something that you don't like so much. And all of a sudden, just this anger comes out. It has nothing to do with the peas. It has to do probably with the fact that there was that stored stress still in the system.
Right.
Now, I use this example because it's very easy to grasp. If you are an adult, which you probably are listening to this, if you have had a scrape of your knee recently, or you've fallen on the pavement, it hurts. Like, we can all say it stings. And so to say to a little person who's never experienced pain, you're fine, get up, be strong. And I mean, I've heard horror stories, Joe, of what children are said to when they're little by their parents, and now they're adults trying to deal with these wounds. It really imprints you, versus that parent that sees you fall and gives you the space to wail, to go red in the face, to get mad, feel the pain, cry the tears, go through that stress response, hit kind of that thermostatic reset in a sense, come down. And then when they come down, and this is how our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system works. When we come out of that stress response, then our higher brain turns on, our social engagement turns on, which is part of our parasympathetic. And then we look for mom, and then we see she's there waiting patiently, not stressed out, calling 911, all those things, and then you will see a kid will naturally reach, like, I want you, I want help, I want to be hugged. And if that happens, that little one is learning to deal with a stress, a painful stressor, a high sensory stressor in relationship with their adults. And then they engage and they reorient to the here and now, and they come out of that stress response.
Yeah.
What's so interesting is that one might say, well, that's so crazy. Like, we have to learn how to toughen these kids up, right? Like, they have to be, it's like at a certain point, yes. But in those moments of pain, you really want to allow that to be felt. So let's just say, Joe, little Johnny Susie, that was their life. They were never allowed to feel. And then we could go for 5 hours on all the examples of how we might get shut down from our feelings and our sensations. But if that's imprinted a little bit every day, a little bit every week, we become that. It's like the frog in the water. It's like, that's just life. You have a little thing that feels not good, suppress it, don't feel it.
Right.
And then we end up being okay. This goes back to your first question beautifully, actually. We end up being okay overriding our physiology in a 9-to-5 work environment, for example.
Yeah.
Right? We override saying to someone, don't say that to me. That doesn't feel good. Boundaries, which is a thing that's become a bit more popular, is setting boundaries and expressing ourselves. But if we weren't allowed to express at that base level, it's going to feel really weird to express ourselves when we're 45 and we've never considered that we've never cried when we've hurt ourselves, for example.
Yeah. I so much questioning into nuance here is coming to mind, because one of the question here that I have is sort of what might in that case, well, it's not so much in that case, but in related cases, because I think this is something people experience a lot today, is almost like a, for some of us, not all of us, there's different emotions, but almost like a stuck state of anger and frustration with the state of the world. And I'll kind of try and maybe throw in a little bit of an example here that relates to some of the stuff that you said. We were talking about this a little bit before the call, and I won't put the name out publicly, but I got into an interaction with a pretty prominent figure in this space, if you will,
Sure.
right before I was doing an interview with him in person, and he was just really upset about something that we had wrote on our website. About some of his work, and it was really not bad at all. It was actually very praising of his work, but he just didn't like a detail about it. And so he's coming at me, and I'm standing there for some reason with a smile on my face. I was super calm, and he's being rude. And there's a lot of other people in the room that had just interviewed him that are looking like, holy shit, right? and he's yelling at me, and not super like crazy, but like, he's really trying to get a rise out of me. And I didn't do it. Now, perhaps I didn't say, hey, why are you treating me like this? Like, I didn't do anything wrong. Maybe that would have been a correct response in that moment. But I kind of just met him with just compassion. I answered his questions. And then all of a sudden it hit a point where he realized, honestly, like, this guy's not reacting. And he just softened up immediately, and we hugged, right? And I asked myself the question, right? Because I didn't engage his emotions, and I didn't fire back, nor did I feel attacked or threatened. I don't know, but I wonder if I had engaged and it came into more of a kerfuffle. And then what happens when people sort of express the anger, then get stuck in that anger, and that anger sort of sits there forever? So what you were mentioning was, let the stress response come up, you express the anger, whatever that looks like, which may not mean, beating everybody up or anything, but just saying like, look, I'm frustrated, like, I'm whatever. How do you describe the nuance between letting it come up, say what you need to say, letting it go down, versus it turns into a blow up, they hold on to it forever, and they're just waiting for the next time to blow up? How do we discern the difference of that one?
Well, you said it beautifully in your example where you just sat there and were gracious with this person's frustration, anger. When you were talking, it almost sounded like, little Johnny Susie. I'll go back to them through our talk. Like, they had fallen off their bike, essentially. Like, they were experiencing a boo-boo. Mm-hmm. Yes, it wasn't physical, but they felt wronged in whatever way with their content, whatever it was, it doesn't matter. But their system was mounting a stress reaction of, this isn't right, this isn't good, sympathetic, fight, flight. And so they're trying to express that to you. You took the road of, we would say, social engagement at I don't know if you're familiar with the polyvagal world, like the vagus nerve, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. You tended and befriended their frustration.
Yeah.
Right? You probably were nodding. You probably were listening attentively. Mm-hmm. You stayed in your physiology. You probably noticed the other people in the room were doing their thing, but you stayed connected. Person got their stuff out, and you engaged. You didn't just get up and walk out of the room. Like, that would have been, right? Standing up and leaving would be like a flight response. It'd be like, I'm out of here. And so there's a difference there too, but you didn't. And so when he saw that you were calm in your nervous system, maybe there was a part of you that was intellectually frustrated, like, where is this coming from? They see it and they're like, okay, I got it out. This is good. And now I can de-escalate the situation, or I can feel myself come out of that. The example of, if you start, sparring with them, let's just say, sometimes that might be warranted. It depends on the situation. And this is again where I try to speak generally, but let's just say you two start sparring and the anger heats up on your side. they get a bit more angry on their side. You know, your stress responses are both coming up and you're not engaging. So when you're in that level of fight, flight, if we keep it real basic, your higher brain goes offline.
Yes.
You are no longer in human cognitive social engagement, empathetic connection.
Yeah.
It's like, imagine if that child that fell off their bike and their parent, like that child started screaming, mommy, mommy, and the father or mother starts screaming back at them, stop screaming for me, you know, like, you're being ridiculous. And we see this sometimes in grocery stores where, you know, I mean, you see it everywhere. It's like, if that child is uncomfortable and you add more discomfort by going more fight, you're just going to have a big problem on your hands.
Yeah.
You know, I have that image of like old Looney Tune characters where like the dust just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
But there's a lot going on there, and it's also quite simple. It's like you de-escalate it by staying in your engagement. Maybe you noticed your breath a little bit, all these sorts of things, and it was able to come down. Now, of course, I don't know if there's something extra in your system that needed to process after that. Maybe there is, maybe there was, but you don't have to process it with that person per se. And the reason I say that, because a lot of folks who are wanting to say work on their old hurts and pains from, say, that parent, for example, or their attacker, there's this old thinking that you have to confront the people.
Yes.
And tell them. It's very common in the AA culture, you know, this is, you know, making amends, telling people what they've done wrong. In my experience, Joe, I've done a video or two about this. If that person isn't able to socially engage and bring their stress levels down naturally, it's a lose-lose situation. Try to confront someone when they don't know how to regulate naturally, because you're just adding more fuel to the fire. And then you, the person wanting to get closure, can get re-traumatized in that attempt to heal that wound.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
Did I answer your question? I hope I did.
Yeah, and it was well said, and I almost want to throw another wrench at you here. You know, a lot of times, right? Because this is for me a lot of I'll preface this by saying, you know, obviously with our work we've been in the personal transformation space for like 13 years, and honestly, there's been, you know, not to be judgmental, but there's been a lot of crap, right? There's been a lot of stuff that's either very flimsy, new agey ideas, all the way over to sort of like this, the personal transformation is all about being just this blunt, like, no, like blah, blah, blah. That's how you grow a backbone and blah, blah, blah. And there's really, it's always procedures and logic and this and feelings filtered through the brain. Very, not so much about, like you're talking about, the physiology, the body, sensing, you know, really finding out what's going on there and processing that way. And so as a result of that, when we're talking here, I can hear, like, you know, sort of the responses sometimes like, well, but anger, so anger is really important. Sometimes we use anger, right? Like right now, the state of our world, we need to use our anger to change and to fight back. That's how we're going to make change, by using our anger. And I think about that and I go, well, yeah, that's a great way to burn out your internal battery. But what are your thoughts on that idea of like using our anger to get something done, or to create the change that we need, or to fix a whatever that means? How would you internalize that and maybe offer a few thoughts?
This is one of my favorite topics. So first we have to understand what anger is. So anger is a natural mammalian emotion. Like it's built into us, and we need it for boundary setting, for protection, right? Again, I use lots of analogies, but that mama bear that has cubs and the wolves are trying to get in to get them, like, she is not going to hold back at growling and hissing and moving forward to protect her cubs.
Yeah.
And we can all agree with that, right? And so there's a natural life force energy that humans possess, that we all have. It's our birthright. But just like my example of falling off the bike, I have to contextualize this question because it goes back to how we were brought up with our healthy aggressive tendencies. So bear with me as I explain this. So when an infant is out in the world and they are with usually the mother, but sometimes the father or nanny or whoever, there'll be an age point. It's like 6 months. It's when more of the sympathetic activation comes into their body and they can like grab things. Like I've got my pen here, like they can see something and they can go for it. And so, I'm a person that has long hair. I've been with babies and they'll pull, they'll pull. Mothers I've talked to will say they'll pound, they'll scratch, especially when they're breastfeeding, they'll bite, these sorts of things. And that is actually a human's, it's like I can hear an engine revving up. It's like that's their life force engine getting turned on and sparked. How that caregiver meets that early sign of healthy, positive aggression will greatly determine how that human later in life is comfortable with their power, with their life force energy. And so if that is met with oh my goodness, look at these strong little hands of yours pulling on my hair or scratching, like you are so powerful. And if that mother or father or whatever can then meet them and play with them and they have a little tug of war, it becomes a fun game. It becomes empowering.
Yeah.
Right? If the flip side happens, which I know occurs because I've talked to moms who are mortified because they've done the latter, which is, that's not right. Don't hit me. If you look at some of the stuff online, and I don't really go into it because it just pisses me off, to be honest, they'll say things like flick the kid on their hands, or give them it's almost like a Pavlovian a training mechanism. It's like if they hit you and you don't like it, you flick them back.
Yeah.
Or you pinch them. My mentor, Peter Levine, would say often there's this idea that little baby just hit or scratched and the mother thinks of the child now as a monster.
Right.
To be basically put back down on the crib and not dealt with. So in that human organism, because at that age, at 6, 8 months, 12 months, there's no cognitive capacity to understand what is coming out of the body.
Sure.
There isn't. It's like they're feeling themselves, they're acting, and then how the environment acts with us will determine how confident we are with that action. So if we are slapped, hit, put down, left to cry ourselves to sleep or whatever, that we will learn very quickly, Joe, because the somatic sense is smart. Don't show that exuberance, don't show that life force, because when I do, I am disconnected from it. I am put in isolation. And even infants know, even though they're not cognitively online, isolation means death.
Yeah.
Right? And so to go back to this question of anger and healthy aggression, the root of the word aggression is Latin it's aggredi, and it means to push forward, to move forward. It isn't about violence or acting out. It's about moving forward. What I see as problematic in a lot of our world is if we didn't have that positive meeting with our primary caregivers, which I don't know the stats, but my sense, Joe, is it's pretty high.
Yeah.
It's pretty high, I don't even want to make a guess, but it's high. If there's that stored life force energy that's never been expressed, and then you add in maybe, abuse and traumas and other things, that stored stuff doesn't just dissolve and go down the drain. It stays in the somatic system as stored survival energy. It's the fight and the flight that wants to break through. It's like, I think of the Hulk, that just breaks out. But then you have an issue, a social issue, you see someone hurting someone, something happens, And it's so primal, it sparks our desire to act, to fight, to move. And so then we have this intense reaction, and we say it's positive, healthy aggression, but often it comes out as very, very violent,
Yeah.
very abusive. Um, I got to share a story. One of my colleagues, his name's Anthony, he is quite the storyteller. He does skits and plays to teach people about trauma. Anthony Wheeler is his name.
Yeah.
And he had this one-man show that talked about his personal journey with trauma. And there was this one scene where he's pretending to be protesting, and this is so apropos for current times now. And he's protesting, pretending he has a sign. And I think they were like protesting something more environmental. I don't know, it doesn't matter. But he kind of interspliced, don't kill the wildlife. And then every now and again he'd go, we hate our dads, and don't take down the trees. We hate our dads. And it was this, if you really listen, basically he was going back to little Johnny and Susie, if I go back to that, they're pissed at their parents because their parents shut them down so early on, but they don't cognitively understand that, Joe.
Yeah.
That frustration as an adult will often not get married to the fact that I was not allowed to sing and dance as a 5-year-old because I wanted to. It's like, shh, be quiet, sit at the table, or you're angry, go to your room. Or the classic, if you're going to cry, I'm going to give you something to cry about.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like we hear my head tingled when I say it, because I remember being in households growing up. My parents, thanks mom and dad, they weren't like that with me. But I remember being in homes growing up as a little kid, because I hung out with lots of friends, where you would hear these things from the parents. It's like, that's not very nice, because I had a knowledge of how a parent should hang out with their kid, not this abuse. So little person gets that abuse, that toxicity. They're not going to fight mom and dad because they know they won't win. Some kids try, but very soon they realize, I'm not going to win at this. And so it gets stored, and then we become adults, and there's so much rage stored.
Yeah.
And some people will become very, very immersed in that culture. And I think we need some people to fight for rights at that deep level. But I always wonder, what would happen if that happened from a place that wasn't out of violence and hate?
Yeah.
And unprocessed trauma in the system versus connection and social engagement. And I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that question,
It feels like $1 million question, and
I know.
I'm sure you've thought about this with your colleagues as well. And I mean, this has been the thing that I've been on a journey of trying to explore for the past 13 years, is just like, how do you create societal change potentially in a society who is so locked into a specific way of life, a specific way of being, that may be shut off from emotions, or maybe shut off from what real community, is and feels like, maybe shut off from the body. And sometimes I wonder if, it's fair to say that we're seeing change happen in our world, but it's minor sometimes, and it feels as though we have the solutions to do way more, but there's an emotional and some other capacity that is missing in humanity. And it feels like because we don't have the capacity to actually create large scale change, we're not seeing it. And I'm wondering how much this plays into all of that.
Well, the word that comes is maturity. So I think that there's something very powerful when someone has a cause that is very acute and very ripe, and it's in the moment, and they use that healthy aggression. And maybe it is healthy aggression, or maybe it's verging on rage and violence, because that can go sideways really fast. But the trouble with fueling the change with that kind of stored anger fight, flight energy is that it's exhausting.
Yeah,
You
100%.
can't, it's like the kid that's having a tantrum. If you actually let them bring it out and have it come out, and you give them a space, and you know they know you're there, they won't keep going for 5 days or 5 months. It's short lived because the system doesn't want to be in that high level of stress. And so what I sort of see happening, and this is just my own personal speculation, is there's a flavor of the month. It's like, let's get pissed off about one thing, and then it has to die because you can only keep up with it. But then another thing, and then there's a little bit of a respite, the batteries are charged, and then the other thing, and then, oh, everyone's on that, and then it comes again. But what I'm kind of curious with, and you said it as well, is the change, it hasn't happened to the degree that we want it to, or that I think many of us know it can happen.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's going to occur until we all know how to understand this physiology of ours, because it won't be sustainable to just go with our fight. It's like an entrepreneur who's burning both ends of the candle, and they're going into their work with adrenaline and fuel.
Yeah.
And we see this in macro situations. It happens every year in January when it's New Year's and New Year's resolutions come. I mean, I was in the fitness industry for 15 years working in training environments, and there was without fail, it happened every January. Adrenalized input of new novelty. We want to make a difference. We want to improve ourselves. It's very behavior based. It's very externally driven. And then if you're lucky, March, if someone can make it to March, you can't keep going in that survival mode. And I know, because I would check people's little forms, where they would come in and tick off that they came in on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And by the time March, it's like, oh, they were only in on Monday. And no, they were only in twice a month. And then the next year it happens again. And so that is another example of how insidious this pattern is in humans. And what I've seen, Joe, is that when someone gets interested in that way in which those survival impulses drive their behavior, and they work with them in a really organic way, the time of the year becomes less important as to how am I feeling in my body and what does my system need now.
Yeah. 100%. I can even say in my own experience, like the times in my life, especially, after I, left college, right? Leaving college was kind of my big moment of finally starting to live life on my own terms versus just sort of following what everyone else was telling me to do. Like I knew I didn't want to take the direction. I always walked off the beaten path, but when push came to shove for the big things, I would toe the society line in a sense, like go and get an education because you have to, even though I didn't want to do that, right? And when I started to do that, I noticed like the more I was in touch with me and when I was in touch with my body, the more I was just calm or very introspective, the more I could I could naturally, you're changing, you're bettering, it's going, versus when you feel very disconnected, you're like, I need to make a change, and you're almost frustrated. And then you try and you set up a plan, you mentally go through it all, and then you're ready to do it, and then it just falls apart. And I think that's a really interesting piece to this whole thing. But and some of the stuff you were mentioning there, when look at society today, we have so many issues popping off, right? We have so many things coming to light, right? We see large scale sort of scandals around sexual abuse or abuse of coworkers, and even just from an emotional level. We see ideas of racism coming up. We see people who are feeling deeply unheard, right? They're almost, and it's not to say, there's a very tricky way to say this. It almost feels like we are placing issues at times where there's not an issue, but it to that person or to a group of people, it is absolutely an issue because they feel something. They feel unresolved in some regard, or they feel unheard. So you're having all these pockets of society looking at each other going, I don't understand what it is you're seeing that you're saying is such a massive problem. I don't get it. And so we're causing fights. And it leads me to the question, a lot of this relates to what's under the surface of what we're thinking, feeling, experiencing, feeling in our body as people. And there almost seems to need to be a massive societal sort of somatic education and psychoeducation process that needs to happen such that we can understand sometimes why an abuser is an abuser. We're not giving them a free pass, but we're saying, you know, this is how we're going to solve the issue. You know, do you feel like that's possible to get us to a cultural point of really having that understanding on a deeper level?
I sure as hell hope so. I mean, to be quite blunt. I mean, everything that you said, I'm nodding because, I was speaking with someone who just went through one of my programs, First Nations individual. And I mean, you're in Canada, I'm in Canada, so we know what's been uncovered with residential schools, which we know about, but mass graves being dug up, which clearly I believe people knew where they were, because you just don't find these things like that, but so that was bringing up a lot of trauma, a lot of energy, a lot of feelings of we have to do something. And yes, well, we have to do something, and it already happened, and we have to make sure it doesn't happen again, of course. But I was speaking with this student, and they had said that, there's so much pain in our community because of these schools, but because of so much. And what they said was so interesting was that they're being given all these tools, like so many resources to help heal their trauma. And we didn't get into all the things that they had been given, but it was probably the classic mindfulness, mind-body work, therapy, talk, getting the words out, that kind of thing. But what they said was interesting. They said, by working on my nervous system, and I'm paraphrasing this, from an individual level and being just with my body in the now moment, I lost the heat around the past. Now, it doesn't mean that you forget the past.
Yeah.
Right? It's like acknowledge the hurts occurred, the abuses occurred, it occurred. But it's like I have this image of everybody just has to look in the same direction.
Yeah.
And when you have people looking behind to the past, and some people trying to pull forward, and other, it's just everyone's in these different directions. And if we believe in energy, which I do, and a group field, when the group field is scattered and chaotic and not looking in the same direction and working with the same thing, the impact is less, to keep it simple. But what they had said was, by focusing just on me and my physiology, I was able to process the pains and the hurts and all those things. The details weren't important so much. It was what is my physiology needing, and how can I come back into the now moment? Now that seems really oversimplistic, and I did just simplify it, but they had said it feels as though I am living in a much more, I can't remember the words, but it was like just more joy, more openness, more freedom. And the reason we were talking is they want more of this work to get into that community, because basically all the things that they've been given haven't worked.
Yeah.
And I believe it, because, there's a reason I've been in this work for as long as I have. I've seen the things that do work, and I've seen the things that don't work. But in terms of that global picture, Joe, of society, I mean, I'm biased, but I'm going to co-opt Peter Levine, one of my mentors' sayings. He's the founder of Somatic Experiencing. He has said that human enlightenment, I don't love the word enlightenment, but his words, I won't misquote him, real human enlightenment will happen when every single human on the planet has a regulated nervous system.
Yeah.
Because when we are regulated, we will not abuse our child.
Yeah.
When we are regulated, we're not going to abuse the earth, the animals. We're not going to forget to feed our child. we're not going to snap at that person at the bank because they miscounted our money, because we're actually connected to the here and now, and we're living not via survival mechanism, but we're living in that more higher brain social engagement, which is part of the parasympathetic, which is unique to humans and mammals. We're living in that like 99% of the time. But we go into a stress response if we do fall off of our bike. We go into a stress response if we do break our ankle, or if someone gives us something that's a little intense. But as I speak to people who have gone down this path of really learning about their physiology and learning the intricacies of it, they do start to see the world differently. The compassion doesn't even, it's not, you don't have to work for it, it's just there. Because you're connected to your internal system, you're attuned to yourself. And when you're attuned to yourself, Joe, and when you're empathetic to the past, you have much more space for what you see in the world.
Yeah.
Is it disgusting to see some of the things that are coming up? Yes. Is it hard and horrific to see some things? Yes. But it also doesn't throw you off because you go, well, of course, we didn't know any better.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, 100%. I want to make sure we come back to some of the discussion around certain things that are maybe not working quite as well when it comes to certain wellness practices. And we'll get into that in one sec. But just before we dive in there, I wanted to kind of bring up this idea of almost like the chicken and the egg question that I've been asking myself for a long time, that, you know, informed the type of media that we try and create. And I wonder if your experience has any light to shed on this question. And it's sort of the idea of, you know, just to sort of set a bit of thing, we've often felt that if we can create news and media that looks at current events, which current events are just a reflection of the state of humanity, the state of humans, right? If we can look at that in a way that is not seeking to engage people into a polarity, but is just saying, look, guys, this is what's happening. Like, how does this make you feel, right? I mean, in getting people to that thing, we felt like that would be a way to almost push us out of a trance, if you will, collectively, that just thinks this world is just about material and political policy and then this decision and that financial decision, which seems to be the overarching thing. And so the question here is, you know, going back to the chicken and the egg. So Peter Levine makes the statement, you know, human enlightenment will come with regulation, right? So that might push somebody to say, well, don't worry about any of what's going on in the world. Focus entirely on just regulating everybody. And then I come in and I say, well, there's a massive portion of people in the world that are not interested in listening to that right now because their eyes and ears and state of being and state of mind are 100% focused on what's going on in the world. And I need to keep up with the Joneses, and I need to make sure that I'm in the economic whatever. And so sometimes it's helping those people hear about certain current events that shakes them out of their trance and goes, now I'm open to maybe hearing about this regulation stuff. I'm wondering, like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, is it possible to get everybody to focus on this, or do some people need more of a logical awakening first, then that might lead into more somatic work? Any thoughts or feelings on that?
Well, the first thing I'll say is I don't think everyone is going to, well, we know this because many people have died in the history of humanity who have never regulated their nervous systems. It's happening probably right now.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
So there can be a honeymoon effect, if you will, when people get into this work because they see how deeply it's changed everything in their life, to their bodies, their symptoms, their relationships, their career. And they want to like basically vomit that to everyone. It's like everyone they see, but it's like they're pushing it down people's throats to the point where very often the person they're trying to tell this stuff to is just pushing back. It's like, right? They're going to walk out the room, or they're going to get defensive, or they're going to shut down, because it's like contextually they've had no prep time to hear this information. So that's one thing that I'll say, because I know that a lot of students get so excited and they just want everyone and their dog, and then they get actually quite traumatized when they try to tell, say, their physician, their medical doctor,
Yeah.
and then the doctor doesn't want to hear it, even though all of their blood panels have changed after doing this work for a
Right.
year. Right. And so you have to, first of all, pick and choose your battles, because that actually can be exhausting. So I don't think, when Peter says that, it's kind of this utopic, oh, everyone's just gonna, like in a movie, like all of a sudden every zombie is awake and alive and everyone's looking to like feel their heart and their gut and connect with themselves and the environment. I don't think it's going to happen like that.
Yeah.
While that would be really cool, if that could happen. I mean, you could do a spoof off of that. I don't think it's going to happen, because here's the thing. So I'm going to go to another side note. I'll hold the question if I forget it. When humans are born into the world, they're not born into the world the way wild animals are born into the world. And my analogy with this is often with bears, because there's bears here in Canada, and I also know there's bears in Russia and in other parts of the world. When a mother bear births her cubs, she treats them the same here as in Europe, for example, right?
Yeah.
Same with the polar bears. I mean, circumstances are different food sources, but she protects them, she keeps them safe, she makes sure they're fed, and trains them and teaches them, and eventually they go off on their own. Humans aren't like that. And no matter how much you try to, teach this, we're at a point where there's just so many different ways in which we've been raised, culturally, religious, tactics, all these things, regulated parents, non-regulated parents. So we're in this situation with however many billion people are on this planet, where we're all so different.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, we all have blood and we all have tissues that are the same, but our wiring is so different. And so to ask humanity to all band together and move forward in the exact same cause, and I'm going to add, and in a way that isn't based in survival,
Mm-hmm.
is going to be really hard, because we've just seen with the last year how quick people were to shift their ways based on a fear response.
Yeah.
With, say, COVID. It showed me, wow, we are really able to follow rules when it's because of a stress and a strain. But my curiosity, and I don't know the answer to this, is could that happen when it's based on neutrality and equanimity and goodness for all and future humans and the environment, and it isn't survival based? So it's like, kind of like, how can we sell, and I say that with air quotes, how can we sell this idea of nervous system regulation with like some kind of weird reverse psychology of fear, but not put fear into people?
Yeah.
I don't know, like, it's kind of strange, because you could push people to the edge by fear tactics around their health. I mean, I could say, if you don't work on your nervous system, that way that your parent died or your grandmother died, that's probably going to be you.
Yeah.
Because that's how genetics work.
Yeah.
And if the stored trauma is still in your system, there it is. Do you want to change that? But even knowing that, Joe, people know their family histories.
Yeah.
They still won't take care of their health until they get that tumor scan that comes back positive as, cancer.
Yeah.
Or that high level of whatever, heart disease. It's like, oh, okay, I better start exercising, so I don't know. I don't know if I've answered your question, but there's kind of this, I'm not sure what the forward motion is to get everyone involved, other than to do the work. I do my work. Those that do the work spread the work in the way they can, but you can't push it.
Yeah.
Because then you're gonna get this backlash effect that isn't what we're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So I know we've had some conversations around how do you make this work sexy.
Yeah.
And I still haven't figured it out, in terms of what it is.
Yeah, and there's so many places we can go with this because it's interesting. Like, I asked the question because, obviously we get a lot of flack for, if you
Right.
cover a particular story, you shouldn't be covering that because it's bad or negative. And it's like, well, on the flip side, we'll get a whole bunch of emails or a whole bunch of comments from people going, wow, my awareness around that and the fact that you didn't do it in a really aggressive way
Mhm.
helps me question this. And now I'm on a different path of
That's great.
questioning things, right? And so you're like, okay, yeah, you can't please everybody. No problem. I get that. And I'm not expecting to please everybody, but I also go down this path and I think to myself, you know, we seem to have this inclination right now with people where I'm 34 years old. I can tell you in the last 13 years of doing this work, 12 years doing this work, right now people are way more primed for being open to change than I've ever seen. And
Hmm.
what I mean by that is there's what sort of we've identified as like a sort of an underserved portion of the population. When I say underserved, I specifically mean on like the media and information front. You have the strict alternative media that's over here that goes really, really deep into stuff that's fringy. Then you have the mainstream media over here, and which is very just toe the line of whatever is mainstream. It's completely inauthentic. It doesn't dig deep at anything. It's failing on so many levels. And then you have this massive, I might say 65, 70% of people in the middle that are going like, look, I want to change something here. I'm open for change. I'm open for conversation. I have
Yeah.
no idea where to go, right?
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
interesting thing is, it goes back to, well, how do you make it sexy? I was listening to a conversation earlier that was talking about, and it was, I think it was Jordan Peterson was involved, Russell
Hmm.
Brand, and there was a few other people that was just, it was going back and forth between different people. And it was discussing this idea of, from a psychological perspective, it almost seems impossible to get anybody to pay attention. I shouldn't say anybody, but to get large groups of people to pay attention to something if there isn't some adventurous polarity that they latch onto that like pushes them through, which usually actually makes this type of work more difficult because you're trying to
Yes.
tell people they need to be fighting something while also regulating themselves, which those are two different energies. Those are two different states of being. Like it's almost odd. And so it leads to this question of like, I think there's a lot of people right now that are sitting back trying to figure out like, how do we as a society, start talking about this without having to market it and package it in some, completely
Yeah.
polarity, fear-driven way. It's fascinating what's happening there.
A few things kind of came to mind because you're right, and it goes back to that sort of analogy I gave you around New Year's resolutions, where there's that push, that energy, that let's do this as a group, and like let's three cheers and all that. And I think that can be useful for some things.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm actually thinking of, are you familiar with Stuart Brand's work?
Mm-mm.
He was, he's still alive. He has got to be in his 80s. He was the founder of the Whole Earth catalog back in like the 60s. It was kind of the one of the first environmental pushes to clean and help the environment. And he has a foundation in San Francisco that is called, and I might butcher this, but it's the Long Now Foundation.
Mm.
And I really got into his work maybe 8, 10 years ago. And he was really pushing the importance of time and looking at things from a very long tail, long-term perspective. I think the long tail is something I think that maybe Kevin Kelly wrote about a while ago, but it's like this, things take time and things need time to really build up and find foundation. But as you were speaking, the one thing that came to my mind, which I'm glad I was sparked to remember this, is if we think about now,
Yeah.
right? Like right now, everyone listening to this probably has some history, ancestral history, where there was trauma, injustice, wherever it is, however it is, doesn't matter because the nervous system just knows it is threat. That's not good.
Yeah.
I've seen people who have had horrific past histories and ancestry, within a period of a couple of years, even sometimes 6 months, completely rewire their entire autonomic nervous system physiology. And we know that because their base organ systems improve. They finally can digest food properly, they can go to sleep at night, their wounds heal, their immune system is good, they're not shouting at their kids, they can drive without freaking out, like all these things. And I often say, isn't it interesting that we can actually shift with the right practices ancestral lineage and wiring in a very short period of time with the right stuff?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like it's like the upside down, right? We're sort of flipping it a little bit, and that, okay, well, it might take, maybe it has to take a long time for us to evolve to be fully functioning, regulated human beings that are driven by creativity and higher brain, and not the autonomic nervous system physiology, which is fight, flight, and freeze. Because if our fight, flight, freeze mechanisms are running the front of the bus, that's all we know, that's all we see, that's how our behaviors are built into us. But if we can flip it quickly, we're actually shifting the past in a matter of a couple of years, maybe even a handful of months.
Yeah.
And then and then my optimism side, because I go between pessimism and optimism. It's like, well, of course we can do this. Yes. Of course we can do this. We can do this. And will everyone want to? No. But there's also something about when you start to see more and more people becoming that way.
Yeah.
It's hard to not follow a little bit, because humans want to be part of something. And so there's that. And then, the other thing that came into mind a few moments ago, usually when people have children involved, or they haven't had children and they know they want to do it differently, there's a little bit more of an impetus to figure it out.
Yeah.
But again, not everyone that has kids has that mindset.
Yeah.
Right? And they have decided to perpetuate the trauma cycles. But the thing is, Joe, most people don't know that they're doing that.
No.
They don't know, right?
And a lot of the books and stuff out there, that are the big mainstream books on how to raise a child. I mean, I've looked at some of them, and it's astonishing, some of the stuff in there. I look at it and I think to myself, like, these are just instinctually horrible ideas that apparently have empirical backing. And I think to myself, what are you basing that on? How are you measuring success in this particular case? How long have you followed that child? Because did you get them to stop crying? Maybe, but is that what you were after? Like, what were we after here? What are we measuring? And that's kind of an interesting question. I'm so glad you brought up the time thing too, because we've always been told, because again, a lot of what we like to do is, what is the thinking behind the choices we make? What is the thinking behind society, right? And so a lot of what we've been told is based on, we look at the past and we say, well, revolutions and changes and this, that, whatever, these all take 50 to 100 years, right? And the only time that ideas don't take time is if it's technological and it's driven by an economy. Then those things can happen real fast.
Quickly, sure.
Right, but we're looking at thinking, we're looking at state of being, we're looking at cultural ideas, we're looking at beliefs, if you will. And I agree with you. I think that things can change very quickly, and that the mechanism that decides how fast something changes does have a lot to the whole topic of this entire conversation, which is awareness, self-awareness, being in the body, being aware of what's happening, asking those deeper questions, which, again, we got to come out of that trance, right? That trance of just living life just purely materially, and that's hard. But let's dive into one of the $1 million questions here, which again relates to that trance. There's been a lot of $1 million questions here, but
I know we're really rich right now.
Yeah.
These questions.
But we see in our society right now, as we're having more and more challenges, the topic of mindfulness has come up. The topic of wellness, right, has blown up. A lot of different practices out there, meditation, we'll distinguish mindfulness, which is different practices you can do, yoga, breath work, all these different things. And I'll just preface this by saying, look, I've used those a lot, and a lot of those have had amazing success for me at times. I've also had times, especially as I've become more and more dysregulated through certain events, where those practices just did not work at all. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit over to some of these practices, because I know a lot of people tell me all the time, hey, I've tried this, and this just does not work. I am not feeling any better. What are your feelings on this?
Yeah, well, that's just the body of everything I've been working with, because you're right there. I got into this work because the traditional, say, physical therapy world, when I was recovering from some injuries in my teens, it just wasn't working. And things that were solid just weren't working with my body. So my curiosity-driven mind just led me to study what we would consider more alternative, but to me is just organic intelligence of utilizing the human system's smartness so that it can relearn patterns naturally. When we think of things that don't work for people and they do work for others, it comes back to that thing at the very beginning. If you can remember, we were talking about the definition of trauma, and I had like person A and person B, and person A was the one that could walk away from the car accident like no problem, and person B would just be a mess forever. And so we have to look at, like, how was the system wired early, and was it wired with that solid regulation where there's good regulation, good co-regulation with the parent? In the situation of little Johnny and Susie falling off the bike, were they allowed to feel their breath be held, and their parent was there to just let them experience this chaos internally, but in a safe way? And so if we think about something like, there's so many things, but say classic breath work. And I know a lot of people who have taught breath work, and they're great. But then I also know a lot of people that have taught breath work and teach it, and they're completely dysregulated. And it's the same in any community. There's always folks that are a bit more solid than not. But if we think about something like breath, it's a tricky one because it is intimately connected, obviously, with our autonomic nervous system. Like, our breath rate changes based on stress, sympathetic arousal, parasympathetic shutdown, all these things. We can change it by breathing, holding, expressing, exhaling for a certain amount of time, all these different patterns. And I'm not opposed to that at all. But if the nervous system physiology has got stored traumatic stress, so that's my definition of stored fight, flight, freeze, and all the ways that might get stored from not being allowed to cry, not being able to feel things, traumas, abuses, etc. We can't say to someone, when you come out of that survival response, you have to breathe this way. We could try, but it's going to miss the mark. It's like a ship coming into port. It's like it just keeps missing where it's supposed to go, and it keeps banging in. It's like it knows it's somewhere there. And so I'm gonna park that. So that's like the breath thing, right? If we think about mindfulness, meditation, and there's so many different types. So I don't want to like put one in a corner, but just this idea of connecting with your thoughts, trying to have them be less intense, less obtuse, connecting with the body, all these sorts of things. If someone has never felt internally what is living inside of them, and then they're asked, well, just sit and feel. Just do that. And they've never considered it, and then they really do. And then they look inside and they feel. A few things can happen. One, they go, oh, okay, I can feel that. It's like, that's easy, kind of Goldilocks situation there, like the middle. Some of the people I've worked with will say that they've tried to meditate, do mindfulness without any understanding of the physiology. And this is no word of a lie, Joe. I've had more than two people say this to me who don't know each other. They would say it was like being locked in a dark room with an angry man screaming at me. That is how I experienced meditating for the first time. And so what is that? Well, that is the fight flight. That is that experience of not being able to feel when you were young, and it down because you probably might have had someone angry screaming at you. And then the other one is this element of mindfulness meditation, and we would classify what I'm about to say as spiritual bypass. I tend to like it more to somatic bypass, and that a person loves meditating and they love being mindful and still and calm. But what it is they're actually feeding their freeze response. They're very good at just being still. I'm kind of changing my tone even as I say that. And I can just be so freaking still and nothing's going to bother me. It's like seeing that gecko on the wall when you're in Mexico, and it stops. And you're just like, are you ever going to move?
Yeah.
And you're like, and you get closer to it and it doesn't move. It is in its dorsal, high tone dorsal of its parasympathetic. It's frozen, it's shut down. So to go back to that question of the things that don't always work, it depends on the person, and it really depends on their state and where they're at and their experience being with their physiology. If they've never even considered that there's this body that has organs, and these organs actually are where our emotions and sensations are held, it either is like a welcomed thing, like, oh, this is cool, or this is terrifying, I can't be with that. Or, and here's the interesting thing, Joe, the person that will go into that bypassy thing, what's often happening is they feel the terror. They feel that angry man screaming at them in a dark closet, but it's happening like a microsecond. And then before you know it, they've flipped into that shutdown. And it's kind of like the adrenaline very quickly turns into an opioid. And that's not technical, but that's like that idea of now I'm just going to numb myself out and let go of the pain. So these practices aren't bad, but when you have a dysregulated system at that autonomic nervous system fight flight level, and you ask someone to do what we would consider in my line of work more advanced practice, you get into trouble because you might contain a little bit of the intensity, but you're actually not releasing it and integrating it and having it fully leave the body the way you would if you had that parent when you were 5 years old who just allowed you to feel the intensity and the tears and all of the somatic experiences that are occurring. So one of the things that I've heard, and I know you and I have talked about this off this channel or after this chat, is people's practices just aren't working in the same way that they did, say, last year or 5 years ago. And I think that there's a few reasons for that. I think one, collectively, we are a little more awake to this thing that is a nervous system, and that human beings are way more complex. And so these practices that kind of got popularized from the 60s and 70s that were really sort of more based in Eastern practices, they came into the West and we took them like we did and we changed them and butchered them in a way, and we've tried them and we're squeezing them to death, trying to make ourselves calm and peaceful like the monks in the Swamis in those areas. But we're at a point now where the world it's not enough just to be quiet and calm and feel, because we have all these emotions and sensations and hurts that haven't been dealt with. And so they've helped us stay contained and stay controlled to a certain degree, but I think collectively a lot of us are just ready to rip these pieces off. It's like it's time to take the Band-Aid off, right? But then a lot of people are not sure where to go, what to do. And it's terrifying when your practice that really did help contain you and calm you down at the end of the day ain't working anymore, you know? So I'm not sure if I answered that question, but there's so many directions we could go with that idea of practices that work, practices that don't work. And here's another complexity for some people. Even in my work, they'll learn a certain practice, a certain skill, and it works beautifully at the beginning of their path. And then 3 months later, they try the one little thing that was like a godsend, and it doesn't work. And it's because their system has changed. They've like entered into another level on the video game. It's like it doesn't work anymore. You've got more things coming at you because you have the layers have been peeled off.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So
yeah, and that's well said. And I think just the idea of what's changing out there and what's going on and these practices of mindfulness sometimes and how things don't work. And it's almost like in one sense we have a greater capacity to actually go into the complexity, and then at the same time there's almost like a desire to maybe we're getting right to the core, or let's get closer to the core. That's kind of emerging, and that's sort of tending us towards the evolution of that idea. And
yeah.
So much of why I'm very passionate about the particular idea of, I don't think that we can just focus on, let's say, just the mindfulness or the meditation, just that piece, is because I've seen for 12 years, just I'm sure as you have, that the people that are, not all of them, I'm not going to say this at all about anybody, but I've seen it a lot. And I've seen it a lot in some of the gurus of the space that I know personally, that are great with the meditations or the mindfulness and all these practices and whatever. But when it comes to, okay, now there's an injustice in the world, or now there's something that I have to actually comment on or change about the world, there's a desire to just either completely disassociate from it. It's like, oh, no, there is no bad happening in the world, or there is nothing. It's just mindfulness, meditation, just focus on this. Mm-hmm. Or it's this like really judgmental, angry, aggressive approach to whatever is happening in the world that they don't like. And so it's led me to ask the question, what are we trying to achieve sometimes with this meditation stuff, and with which I'm behind, I love, I think is great. With the mindfulness stuff, what are we tending towards? And I think sometimes what our intention is and what we're trying to do, what life we want to live, both individually and collectively, is almost just such an important question to ask in the context of what are we doing when we're engaging with these practices. Do you have any feelings on that?
Yeah. There's a concept in our work that I've sort of popularized a bit where I call it neuroplastic healing sequencing. So neuroplastic is neuroplasticity, the capacity for not just the brain, but everything to change and rewire and unwire. So neuroplastic healing, obviously that goes without saying, and then sequencing things properly. And, if we think of the human, again, it's really basic, but and some people will argue on this with me, but we are an animal being. Like there's physiological evidence, as we know, that we share certain traits to other animals, obviously. But then we have this higher brain thing going on here in the prefrontal cortex. And as much as there's all this brain science revolution and crazy things that we can measure, I still believe that we are so at the start of this understanding of what the human, not just brain, but what our consciousness can do, right? And I've dabbled into telepathy and past life trauma and all these things, and I'm like, it's very interesting. And so if consciousness is a technology that we can use, and if it's a very advanced technology, That technology, in my opinion, in my theory, will explode when the human animal part is completely taken over in a very smart, healthy, oxygen rich way. I mean, if we think about breath work, one of the reasons why we breathe, we're breathing all the time, it just is happening, but people focus on it to try to oxygenate the blood, right? People that are sick with chronic conditions, their metabolism doesn't work, and so there's stagnation in the system. And sure, you can do lots of intense breathing to oxygenate the blood, but if there is that shutdown response, that functional freeze governing the entire system, you can breathe as much oxygen as you want, and that oxygen isn't going to know how to go into the right places, and it's certainly not going to stay that way. And so that's why there's a tendency to me to rely on those techniques. That might finish off my breathwork part from my previous part. But this ability for the human to really utilize these higher meditation, mindfulness pieces, and even let's say spirituality, Joe, because what I've again heard, and this is of course anecdotal from just all the people I've worked with, people will say, when I got my biology and my physiology on board and regulated, the spiritual connection just happened. I didn't have to journal it. I didn't have to have my mala beads. I didn't have to sit and meditate. It just was flowing through me. And when I see that and when I hear that, and I've experienced that, I kind of say, well, Christ, like, what if we just got regulated, to go back to Peter Levine's thing, he's a smart man. It's like, if we actually just had that, maybe we all would just automatically turn on these higher super consciousness mechanisms that are just begging to be opened up. And we get blips of it. And I think, Joe, that's why so many people have been interested in, say, psychedelics and these very potent plant medicines that shamans have used, is because it kind of bridges you into that quickly. But I also know from working with folks that has a danger as well, because if your physiology isn't grounded, and we get emails from people who have gone into these ceremonies and they have been bedridden for months because their physiology wasn't ready for that openness to that higher consciousness, and they get terrified, and then the system shuts down, or it goes into kind of a more psychotic state. And so that's the side that often doesn't get talked about. But so my sense is these higher level technologies, meditation, mindfulness, are important, but I also have a sneaky suspicion that when more of us have that regulation, because think about it, like, imagine this, let's just say everyone in your neighborhood, in my neighborhood, in my city has more nervous system regulation on board. Maybe not 100%, but just a little bit more evolved humanity, not living in survival. So you go out into your world, you grocery shop, you go to a restaurant, you're with a waiter, the bus driver, everyone is just chill and connected. You don't need to go home and meditate and clear your mind, because you haven't been thrown into a stress response for the entire day. But because it's not matched up yet, we do need those practices to ground and settle, because we're not at that kind of tipping point level. I know there's a name for that, where you reach a certain percentage and then things shift. But that's kind of my sense, is I think we've kind of gone backwards. I think we started with these higher level technologies first, when really we almost, it's like, what if we had started with, and I think it's happening now, it's like we've tried all these really fancy things. And I often joke with some of my students, it's like, yeah, this work is kind of like watching paint dry.
Yeah.
Because you're literally staring and looking out in the environment without anything that mind-blowing. But it's also what a baby does. a natural, a human comes into the world, they just look.
Like you were saying, okay, so first off, the piece about um, the more we understand about like the question of like who we are, so our bodies, our humanness, our what is going on there, the consciousness, technology that's there, and we're asking the question of like what does it really mean to be human in a sense. And I look back at my own life experience too, and I think to myself like the times where I felt just almost for years at a time just in a incredible flow, if you will. That's the piece that you said about just the consciousness, the higher consciousness always being there. That's 100% what I've experienced. And it's interesting because I remember telling a good friend of mine in 2017, late 2017, I said to him, I was like, I feel like my higher self, my consciousness has turned off. And that was at the start of my chronic dysregulation.
Yeah.
And so when you said that, I was just like, oh my Jesus, that seems like it is 100% right, like on point. And what's interesting too is I think back, because the psychedelic renaissance, if you will, has very much been growing. I used to write about it a lot in 2009, 2010 from the standpoint of, I thought it was really interesting to see some of the research that was coming out, the studies that were coming out, treating people with PTSD and sort of stuff on a one-on-one basis, not 60 people in a room doing ayahuasca or a whole bunch of people tripping on mushrooms in a park, whatever. But I'm talking about like legitimate therapy here, like legitimate therapy.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people don't realize too, like even ayahuasca is, historically is used in a one-on-one setting very, very specifically. It's not, a whole bunch of people in a room taking massive doses and just like, okay, have fun. You know what I'm saying?
Not a rave, no.
Right. And so, I remember back then I was just reading about all this stuff and I was kind of engaged in like the new research, and I had got a message from my higher consciousness. Well, that's what I'll call it. And it was, they're not needed at this time for the vast majority of people. They were designed, Earth provided it at a specific time that was really helpful for those cultures at this time. But our evolution of consciousness now says that you don't necessarily require it. Now, that doesn't mean never use it or whatever. It's just that was the feeling that I got, because personally I never had really been drawn to them, and I was very curious about them. And it came to this thing where the message that I felt was, we have the entire capacity within us, within our natural state of who we are, to have access to what is required to play within this experience without having to go off into the galaxy of wherever you might be taken on an experience. Which, if people want to have that experience, by all means. But there's something deep here that's already within us that that needs to be brought back online, if you will. That's what it feels like.
100%. And if we think of, and again, I will be very clear. I think for some, it will work beautifully in a controlled, safe setting with foundations on board, meaning a person has done some work to know how to be with their physiology in intensity.
Yeah.
So yes. And we go back to that idea of however many billion people who are not regulated and have deep, deep depressions and troubles and anxieties. There aren't going to be enough people to facilitate that kind of interaction at that level.
Yeah.
It's impossible. And it sort of comes in why I shifted out of my private practice it was rewarding, but I was frustrated with the little impact of just working one-on-one with someone. Now, I still work one-on-one with people, not like on the other way. Like I will see an osteopath, I'll see a craniosacral therapist, that kind of thing for my own personal needs because of my history. But not everybody needs that one-on-one, because again, what I've seen is the intelligence is really in our system, but we've gone so far away from it. We've bleached ourselves of realizing that we have organs in our bodies. For example, like a lot of that stress and trauma is stored in the organ systems, for example. And so, no, I agree with you. And I believe that we can do a lot with education, with very simple practices. But one of the key things that's important, Joe, is for people to not only want the work, but they have to believe that they deserve to have it.
Yeah.
And that goes back to my very first, example with little Johnny and Susie. If you were taught that your feelings and your sensations and your healthy aggression, back to that baby example, was stopped, wasn't allowed, was shamed, was shut down, you will have your work cut out for you, because you have to literally, and you can, and I'll say this right now, it is possible, but there needs to be a very strong desire to gain back the birthright that baby never occurred, which is the deserving of being a human.
Yeah.
Like a full-on human with expression and emotion and visceral qualities, but also that, when a child starts to have creativity, you see it's the best age, 2, 3, when little kids start to get their personalities and the way that they play and they look at you, and it's like, to get that spark back is the coolest thing ever, because then as soon as someone feels that and taps into that, it's almost like you give them unlimited fuel source.
Yeah.
Because they've touched into that spark of just awe and potential and authenticity and rawness, all these buzzwords that the self-help development world kind of throws out.
Yeah.
But most people don't realize where it's like it was there to begin with.
Yeah.
But it's also possible that you never were allowed to express it because of the circumstance growing up. And so that's where it is important to understand the past, or to have an inkling, like, if I'm saying this right now, and if someone's like tearing up or having an anxiety reaction to even just this conversation, chances are there's stored survival stress from those earlier years. Because when that happened, when we were really young, we won't have a cognitive memory of being told to go to our room.
Yeah.
Right? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and well said. And it's funny, just as a tidbit, I was listening recently to one of Gabor Mate's books, and he was discussing certain childhood stuff, and I was on the lawnmower, just driving around the land, doing my cutting, listening, and I'm starting to tear up as I'm driving around, hearing some of the stuff, and I'm like, oh man, this is part of my story in some way, shape, or form, right? And I just wanted to share that tidbit just to allude a little bit to what you were talking about there. But as always, I love our conversations. I feel like we can go on all day about this kind of stuff, and there's so much powerful stuff here. But thank you so much for coming on and doing this. Where can people find out more about your work and maybe get started with a few things?
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for bringing me on. Just my name is my site. So Irene Lyon, Lyon.com. Everything is there. There's a lot on the site, whether it's my resources, my YouTube videos, which I have hundreds and hundreds, ebooks, and then the courses and programs that I run online. I no longer see people in one-on-one private practice. And I have actually found that in some ways, the way that we have formulated the group work and the online work is almost just as powerful, if not more powerful, because people are going into it at their own pace. They're taking their time. They're getting a full-on apprenticeship in deep biological terms. So I'm all about teaching my students the non-dumbed down version of everything I've learned in my trainings. I'm not teaching biochemistry or anything like that, but like how the nervous system works, how it gets stuck, how memories work, how emotions work at that sensory level. But we're not talking about things like the amygdala or the parts of the brain. We're really working with, in the courses, the felt sense of the body, the visceral sense, how we connect to the environment, and then how our higher brain can get the information on board so that when we are having that what we would consider panic attack randomly in the middle of the night, we actually can put our higher brain thinking cap on and go, whoa, this is that thing that Irene was teaching us of my fight flight system sparking up in the middle of the night for no reason. But this is where I have to sense, this is where I have to feel. And as simple as that sounds, that is kind of the entryway into these old past traumas that we often have no clue that we're still storing in our system. So everything's on my site.
All right, so we had a few technical difficulties at the end there, no big deal. You can head on over to irenelyon.com and you'll check out all of her videos, articles, everything she has to get you started in diving more deeply into this work. As we always say, the personal transformation and the exploring of current events and what they say about ourselves is the key. These things cross over, they overlap. This has been the inspiration behind our work for the last 12 years, is really trying to see how humanity's story plays into why we create the world that we create. And when you ask the question, where do our stories come from? Where do our beliefs come from? Where does, our ways of thinking come from? We have to start looking at our experiences. We have to start looking at our beliefs. And the more we dive into that, the more we have to look at ourselves, the way we're functioning, the way we're feeling, right? We start having to look at how our lives are colored by our experiences, how our bodies are colored by our experiences. And ultimately, what we're seeing when we dive into this work is that the way our bodies are functioning, the way we feel, the cumulative stress that builds up, the changes that makes in the body can have a massive impact on how we actually see and perceive our world, how it changes our executive functioning, which is really just our higher thinking. It's where our logic comes from. It's where our reasoning comes from. It's where our empathy comes from. It's where our connection comes from. And the more our body gets out of tune and the more it gets dysregulated, right, which can happen through experience all the way going back to childhood, the more we're going to color our current reality in a way that may be missing a lot of those features that I just previously mentioned with the executive functioning there. So this is a huge, important place to start in creating a community and creating a world that's well regulated, that's sitting in a good place within our bodies, such that we can engage in creating a meaningful discussion around how we're going to create change from a standpoint that's solid. So this is a huge part to the picture. Thanks so much for watching this, and I truly hope you start engaging with some of this work if you haven't already.